On today's Locked On Jayhawks, what is the ceiling versus what is the floor for this year's KU football team?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. Find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and this is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every show. We are free and available anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. And on today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're talking ceiling of making the college football playoff. Is that the ceiling for KU football? What is the floor for KU football? How exactly it would happen? And we're 37 days away from Kansas and Lindenwood in the opening game of the season for KU football here for the 2024 season. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So we're going to start with ceiling conversation. Let's start with the good stuff before we get to the floor conversation. So the ceiling. How exactly does this happen? Let's get to that before we get to what exactly that would mean, I think, from a results perspective. I think the journey itself for KU to hit its ceiling, Jalon Daniels has to stay healthy, right? That's like number one thing in terms of how KU gets to that point. Like Jalon just has to stay healthy. And in general, Kansas has to stay healthy, right? If you're talking about having a special season, you as a team need to stay healthy. And there is a little bit of, I guess, fortune in that happening for any team who goes far or has a special season. Like you do need a little bit of luck in order to do that. And so that will become something that is important for KU. That's not necessarily something you can predict. That's not necessarily something you can, be like, oh, we're going to have to deal with this injury or this player being out for this game. How can you overcome that? And yes, there is a certain element of, for like injuries that maybe keep somebody out for one game, for two games, like there is an element of the team's depth and the backup players. Are you good enough to step up in those situations? That'll be important. But as far as like the big injuries or like Jalon Daniels injuries, those are things that you need to avoid. If you took right now, if you said Jalon Daniels is going to give you 10 games of the 12 regular season games, and you said he'll be perfectly healthy for those 10 games, would you take it or would you roll the dice? If I said 11 games, I think you would definitely take it, even not knowing what that 12th game would be, right? It could be the K-State game, and that would really suck. But I think you would take that. The 10, I think, kind of becomes interesting. I don't know. I might still take that. But obviously, it's not something that, Jalon is some guys, that's just how it goes. It's unfortunate. Like, it's just kind of crap luck at the end of the day. But that would be part of it in terms of how KU would hit the ceiling. What else would have to happen for KU to hit their ceiling? Well, I think Logan Brown and Bryce Foster would have to raise the ceiling of the offensive line, which means both of them are playing at a high degree, are playing close to what their ceilings are. I think Michael Ford is a fantastic guard for KU. I feel good about where Kobe Baines and Bryce Cable do. They really raise the floor, I guess, of the KU offensive line. But what are you going to get from Logan Brown and Bryce Foster? Both of those guys are former like 5-star recruits on the offensive line, players who, in the case of Logan Brown, started at Wisconsin, who is like offensive line university. And in the case of Bryce Foster, started in the SEC as a true freshman. Those guys are guys that can raise the ceiling of this offensive line. I think the floor on this KU offensive line is good. They should at the very least be, top half unit in the Big 12, top 5-ish unit in the Big 12. They should be very solid at the very least. But if Bryce Foster and Logan Brown are both players who hit their ceiling, are both really good players, all of a sudden maybe this can become like a top 3 offensive line in the Big 12. And that would certainly help KU get to their ceiling as a team. Everything has to click under Jeff Grimes for KU to hit their ceiling this season, right? I mean, you're talking about a year one offensive coordinator. There is a learning process for everybody. Now, for a veteran team like Kansas has, you probably have that learning process go a little bit quicker. And I also think that for a veteran team like Kansas has, like maybe there is an element of, it's kind of nice to have a new offensive coordinator going into your final season and that it keeps you on your toes and that it feels like you're keeping things fresh. Because sometimes we do see teams that the college level that bring like everybody back and they just don't get better and things just get a little bit stale for that team. You can't allow that to happen with a new offensive coordinator. Now, certainly that is a big loss to lose Andy Kotelnicki, but I think Jeff Grimes will be a good offensive coordinator too. And seems like recruits really like him. But everything kind of has to click from that perspective. Special teams and defense both have to become top 50 units. So you look last season, both of these were closer to being in like the 60 to 70 range in terms of offense and special teams. For Kansas, they both have to finish top 50. That would be a nice jump while still realistic, right? That's not asking them to be top 25 of both. And you look at last year's team, went 9-4, and you look at all of your losses except for the Texas loss were games that easily could have won. So if all of a sudden you make your defense a little bit better and you make your special teams a little bit better, and both of those are achievable, okay, there's maybe an extra win. There's maybe an extra 2 wins, right? Maybe you avoid even being in a situation where you have a game come down to the wire because of those things. So I think both of those have to happen. And I think all of these things that I'm saying are realistic things, right? I can talk to you about, well, the ceiling, of course, for every team is to go 16-0, and Jalon Daniels is going to throw 100 touchdowns, and that's not realistic, right? These are realistic things that I think could happen and help KU get to that ceiling. And then I think better turnover margin. So Kansas a season ago ended up, I believe, +1 in the turnover margin. And, that was fine. But for a team to have a special season, especially in the case of a school like Kansas, who, it's a little bit harder to just dominate each and every place, you typically have to be like in a really good spot from a turnover perspective. And so to have that special season combines having a lot of talent and doing a lot of these other things well with, okay, it happened to be our year from turnovers, and you just kind of have all the moons align in a really real way. So KU being +1 a season ago, can they have a season where you're like +8, +10? Now, I do think there is a certain element, there's a certain element of luck in turnovers. Like part of it is, okay, did the other quarterback just happen to throw a really bad pass? Or did he happen to, have a pass that tipped in the air and you happen to be in the right situation? Or did he throw one right to you? Or where did the fumble go, right? Like there's a lot of luck involved, I think, with fumbles, maybe more so than interceptions. There is still a very big element of skill involved in turnovers. Did you punch the football out? Is that something that you practiced? If you tend to have more players around the ball, meaning are you a good gang tackling team, meaning do you have good athletes who get to the football well, you're going to tend to get more fumbles in theory, or you're going to tend to catch more of those tips, right? If you have more players around where the football was thrown and have tight coverage, you're going to have more players around ready to catch a tip. So there is that fine line, I think, kind of between the two. And I think that's just something that you hope for Kansas can go up a little bit more, because the turnover luck could swing one of those games, right? I said that the Kansas 3 of their 4 losses, you look at the Oklahoma State loss, the Kansas State loss, and you look at the Texas Tech loss. Nothing comes to mind off the top of my head in the Texas Tech game specifically, but in the Oklahoma State game, you had like a near pick 6. I forget if it was Kobe or Mello who had it when they were like in the red zone. I want to say it was Kobe who nearly had a pick 6, right? That's one swing of a possible turnover thing that could have changed that game. Then you had Rich Miller dropping that possible pick 6 in the game against Kansas State that could have just put the game away and had you win the game, right? So those are things that could have swung 2 games. You have to have a better turnover margin, I think, this year if you want to hit your ceiling. Because of all that, if you do those things, your top 50 off, or your top 50 defense, your top 50 special teams, right? You're where we're at when we're talking about the offense, which would involve staying healthy and Jalon staying healthy. The offensive line, their ceiling gets raised. So basically your top 10 offense with everything clicking with Jeff Grimes, you have that better turnover margin. If all those things happen to hit your ceiling, and because of that combined with the schedule that you play, where you don't have Arizona, you don't have Utah, Texas and Oklahoma are gone out of the conference, the ceiling is legitimately like an 11-1 record for KU. Or like, let's say at that point you're in the Big 12 title game, 11-2 or 12-1. Like that is legitimately the ceiling with a Big 12 title. And if you're winning a Big 12 title, especially if you win 11 or 12 games, I guess it's possible if the Big 12, if you snuck into the Big 12 championship game at like 8-4 or somebody and they won it, and with the right tiebreakers and they were 9-4, maybe you don't get it in the playoff, but that's probably not going to happen. So realistically, you win the Big 12, you're going to be in the playoff. And yeah, if you're 11-2 winning the Big 12, you're going to make the college football playoff. And there's a real chance you would be a top 4 seed, because the top 4 conference champs get that. And then you would be on to the quarterfinal round. So that is the ceiling for KU. It is legitimately winning the Big 12. It is legitimately making a college football playoff. And boy, would that be wild from where this was. We're going to continue on. What does the floor look like? How does it get there? What would that be exactly for KU, the realistic floor? We'll get to that in just a moment. And also, we are 37 days away from KU Lindenwood. So we'll talk about the significance of that number and being that many days away on Locked On Jayhawks. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. You know, you might think that there's not as much going on right now. We are in kind of the doldrums of the sports season, but there still is a lot going on. The basketball tournament is going on, TBT. You got golf tournaments going on each and every week. MLB is in full swing, and Bobby Witt is just killing it. The Royals doing well. It's also preseason college football time. You might have your preseason college football magazine. You might be getting ready for the season by listening to this show or listening to Locked On Big 12 or one of the other Locked On opponents that KU is going to be playing this season. And you want to bet on a future for the season, over, under wins, Heisman, national championship, who's going to make the playoff. And this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com to start making the most out of your summer. Official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you to everydayers tuning into each and every show, and thank you for hopping onto this. If you're new to the show and maybe you want to become an everydayer, of course, you can check out all across our Locked On Podcast Network for plenty of more content. We're going to have Phil Steele on with us of Phil Steele Magazine fame. He's going to join us on tomorrow's show of Locked On Jayhawks, so you're not going to want to miss that one. Let's talk floor. How does Kansas get to their floor, and what exactly would that look like? Again, this is realistic. Again, we could talk about how, well, the floor is this player, this player, this player, this player, this player gets hurt, and you throw 20 interceptions, and just everything goes wrong, and you go 3-9, and it's like, okay, I guess everything is possible because, you know, in a human world where they're playing human sports, like anything can happen, but this is like realistic ceiling and realistic floor. So how that would happen, how the realistic floor would happen for KU. Bad health, that's kind of the opposite of something we talked about earlier. And maybe most specifically, it would be bad health to Jalon Daniels. You don't have the Jason Bean kind of trump card you get to play as the backup quarterback anymore. Now, maybe Cole Ballard takes another step up. Maybe Isaiah Marshall is just that dude and he is ready to go, and you get similar play if that does happen. But just in general, bad health and even beyond Jalon Daniels, right? That can be something that can take you closer to your floor. The offensive line can't overcome the losses of Dominic Pooney, Mike Nowitzki, and Armaj Reed-Adams. So as much as I still think very highly of this offensive line, you know, what if not having Mike Nowitzki really hurts the offensive line from like a mental perspective and pointing out blitzes and knowing who's going to be blocking who and picking things up, right? Because as much as each individual offensive lineman is important, that really is a unit that has to play together and knows who's picking up. You know, they're bringing a guy through the A gap, or they're bringing somebody around the edge. They're bringing an extra player here. Like, how are they going to block that? How are you going to sort that out? Or are you going to let somebody go straight to the quarterback? So that's very important, right? And Bryce Foster, I think, should be able to fill in for Nowitzki, but what if it does take more time than you expected? As much as I am high on Logan Brown, I mean, you're replacing Dominic Pooney. That dude was a third-round draft pick in the NFL draft to the 49ers. That's a big loss, right? What if Armaj Reed-Adams breaks out this season after already having a solid year a year ago, and you can't overcome that? So what happens if your offensive line just ends up being a little bit worse than it was a season ago? The offense isn't as dynamic with Jeff Grimes instead of Andy Kotelnicki. One of the biggest things that Andy Kotelnicki did with the KU offense over the past couple of years is hit big plays. And that is such a difference maker in really all levels of football. Typically, the best offenses, the best teams are the ones that hit the most explosive plays. And there are exceptions to the rules and stuff. But for the most part, if you're having to grind your way to scoring drives each and every time, you're going to have better chances of fumbling the football or throwing an interception or missing a field goal or having a 10-yard holding play that is just going to mess with the drive. And yeah, you'll have, you know, long drives throughout the game. Like, you have to be able to excel in those situations, but it's not sustainable to have to do long drive touchdowns each and every single time. It just becomes a grueling process. Eventually you need to bust one and get an easy one or two over the course of a game. And KU has been excellent at that over the course of Andy Kotelnicki. What happens if that's not the case as much with Jeff Grimes and you can't mesh as much? Then you would be closer to the floor. One of the other ways that you'd be closer to the floor, the defense doesn't get any better. In fact, it gets worse, because you could say that, okay, you were about a middle of the pack defense nationally a season ago. Now you're losing Austin Booker, who was, You could take Kobe Bryant or Melo Dotson, and I'm here for that argument as well. But Austin Booker, just as valuable as any defensive player as you had a season ago, because you look at how important pass rush is and how good he was. You lose him, you lose some experience at linebacker. What if my prediction that the linebackers are going to be better is actually wrong? And just by losing those players, it actually gets worse. And now you're worse at defensive line. And even if you have all this talent in the secondary, but you're without Kenny Logan now, it just doesn't matter because you can't get to the quarterback. And even the best corners in the world aren't going to be able to cover a guy for 5 seconds. Like, it just doesn't matter, right? So that kind of becomes the big question here. So the defense doesn't get any better. And then the turnover margin doesn't go KU's way. The defense isn't as good. Now, all of a sudden, you're -5 in turnovers this season. The turnover luck's not going your way. Those are ways that you could get closer to the floor. And then the last thing would be the special teams without Sean Snyder gets worse, because before Sean Snyder, like, KU obviously they dipped at the end of the season, right? There were a lot of special teams mistakes over the last handful of games, over the last half of the season. It felt like the Trevor Wilson punt return against UCF, which was an absolute electric play, one of the plays of the year, honestly, for KU football season ago. It felt like it was kind of downhill from there. And obviously the K-State game, it felt like that was kind of the summit of it being bad in a real way, with the muff punt and everything like that. What happens if the special teams continues that trend, or what happens if just in general, because even though it did suffer that dip at the end of the season, overall in the season, you look at like special teams efficiency grades, KU still ended up close to nationally average a season ago. The year before that, they were one of the worst in the country, which is what we've typically seen year in and year out since the Mark Mangino days. So what happens if, with not having Sean Snyder anymore, who at the very least got you up from being one of the worst to being like around nationally average, you go back down to being one of the nationally worst. And that's a way that could swing another game against you and against your favor. So if that stuff all happens and you do end up closer to or at your floor, I still do think, given the schedule, given how much talent Kansas has, given how much I do trust the coaching staff, I still think the floor in that situation, like if all that stuff goes wrong, is you're still like a bowl team, which in its own, like, yes, it would be a disappointment at this point, given how high the expectations are that you want to play for a Big 12 title and all these things that are in front of you, preseason ranked team and stuff. If you ended up going just 6-6 or something, that would feel like a bit of a disappointment. But big picture, it would be the first time you've ever made 3 consecutive bowl games. You know what I mean? So like, it still would be an overall success while being that season feeling a little bit bittersweet. But that's if all that stuff went wrong. And I still think then your floor at that point is like 6 to 7 wins. So I guess what I'm saying here is, if I'm saying the floor is, 6 or 7 wins, and the ceiling is maybe 10 to 11 wins, probably means somewhere in the middle. Whereas if some of these things happen and some of them don't, on both sides of the coin, is you're looking around 7 to 9 wins, right? Like 8 to 9 wins. That's kind of the middle ground of where you were, which would kind of put you at where you were this past season, right? Maybe you just don't show that huge leap of how much better you can be. So 8 to 9 wins with a ceiling of, I would say, 10 to 11 wins in the regular season, with the floor kind of around 6 to 7. I think that's kind of the range of where Kansas is going to end up as, based on where some of those things fall at the end of the day. All right, we're 37 days away from that season kicking off against Lindenwood. Let's discuss that number 37 on Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for joining us here on Locked On Jayhawks. Again, we're going to have Phil Steele on with us on tomorrow's episode, and we are 37 days away. By that episode, we'll be 36 days away from Kansas versus Lindenwood. So as we've been doing with how many days away when we're doing a football show here on Locked On Jayhawks, we are talking about the significance of that number. So 37 days away. Well, Taiwan Berryhill had 37 tackles a season ago for KU football. And for Berryhill, he actually had a better season before. He'll be a senior this season. So, you're looking at a guy who I guess was a junior last year. And then the 2 years ago, the 2022, that would have been his sophomore season. So he had a better season as a sophomore than he did as a junior. And like, you look at the Pro Football Focus grades, like that kind of backs it up. I think the eye test would kind of back that up. I think that maybe even like the counting stats would back that up. Now, I think part of it was because he wound up having, like, he was playing through different injuries. I can't remember what the injuries were that he suffered through, but the PFF grade, it was pretty harsh for Taiwan Berryhill. So you go back through his career, he was a limited snaps in 2020. He had a good grade then, 67.7, but that was like a very limited snaps that year. 2021, he ended up having a 47.8 PFF grade. And again, like 60 is like power 5 level starter, or is just like starter level. And so 65 is like average starter, 60 is average level starter, something like that. 53.5 in 2022. So you got a little bit better from 2021, but then it goes down to 29.7 out of 100 this past season. And again, I think he was playing through injuries because he was injured at different points throughout the season and like before the season started that significantly hurt his performance when he was on the field, that he wasn't the same guy, that he wasn't as quick and wasn't as fast. So I expect him to be better this year if he can just be healthier. But I think it becomes interesting because you have these two budding emerging linebackers in JB Brown and Cornell Wheeler. Like, do they end up usurping Taiwan Berryhill and he doesn't end up playing as much this season? I think that'll be very interesting. Or do you get the best version of Taiwan Berryhill that is ready to go in his final season with KU? And then number 37 on the roster is Graydon Addison. So last year it was Addison and Hayden Hatcher. I don't really have much to add about Graydon Addison, who's your backup punter. But with Hayden Hatcher, I think that becomes interesting because I was just thinking about this. If Hayden Hatcher was back on this year's team, would he be by far their best option as the weak side defensive end? You know, like, would he be by far the hands down lockdown starter? I mean, he ended up being like an or at the beginning of the season with Austin Booker, and we saw how that turned out for Austin Booker. So the fact that he was even an or with Austin Booker is pretty expressive to what Hayden Hatcher did in the offseason and did and working his tail off to get to where he was at the end of his career at KU. But yeah, now you have some questions there. Maybe you wouldn't if even Hayden Hatcher was there, which I don't know. That might be a little scary for the defense. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We'll be back tomorrow to talk with Phil Steele of Phil Steele Magazine to look at KU football, to look at the Big 12 and a little bit more. So if you do have a question for Phil Steele, hit me up at D Johnson Radio on Twitter. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. We'll see you next time with LOJ.